She was 6 months pregnant. He was arrogant, and in front of his entire family, he did something he thought would end their marriage. But what he didn't know was that she'd already orchestrated his downfall. She owned the company he'd bragged about building. Every single share, every contract, every investor relationship. And by the end of that night, his life was about to implode in ways he never saw coming. This is the story of Marcus and Elaine, a marriage built on ambition, a partnership that became a battlefield, and a moment of violence that exposed the truth he'd spent years ignoring. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next will change everything you thought you knew about trust, power, and revenge. How did she do it? How did a woman work inside her husband's company, grow their wealth together, restructure their assets, without him realizing she was the real power behind the scenes? And what made him so confident that night, so absolutely certain he could humiliate her in front of his family, when she was literally sitting on a secret that could destroy everything he'd built? For 5 years, they were partners. For 5 years, she watched him take credit for her ideas. She watched him present her strategies as his own innovations. She watched him minimize her contributions in board meetings while she said nothing. But her silence wasn't weakness. It was patience. And patience, as it turned out, was the most dangerous weapon of all. This is their story. Their story began like so many others. Marcus and Elaine met at a networking event in downtown Chicago in 2018. Marcus was 32 years old, charming, with the kind of confidence that fills a room. He had an idea for a tech consulting startup. Elaine was 30, sharp, brilliant with numbers, and she had connections in venture capital that Marcus desperately needed. She was working as a chief financial officer at a mid-sized financial services firm, making excellent money, but something about Marcus's vision intrigued her. He promised her equity. He promised her partnership. He promised that together, they would build something extraordinary. So she quit her job. She invested her savings. She moved in with him. And for 5 years, they were unstoppable. Zenith Dynamics grew from nothing to 40 million in annual revenue. They hired 20 people, then 50, then 100. The company was their baby. Or at least, that's what Marcus told people. That's what he believed. What nobody understood was the dynamics behind closed doors. When Marcus held board meetings, he was the visionary. When investors asked about strategy, he was the innovator. When articles were written about Zenith Dynamics, his name was in the headline. Elaine was introduced as his wife, sometimes as the CFO, sometimes not mentioned at all. She restructured their entire financial infrastructure when the company was struggling in year 3. She brought in venture capital partners who tripled their valuation. She negotiated a contract with their largest client that became 40% of their revenue. And every single time, Marcus took the credit. He'd say things like, "I saw the potential, and I made the connections." Elaine watched this happen again and again. In private, she said nothing. She only watched. And she only planned. Because while Marcus was busy attending conferences and giving interviews about his entrepreneurial journey, Elaine was quietly meeting with lawyers. Sophisticated lawyers. Corporate attorneys who specialized in equity restructuring and corporate ownership. She began moving assets, creating shell entities, establishing voting shares in her name through legal mechanisms that Marcus had signed off on without fully understanding what he was signing. By the time she discovered she was pregnant, Elaine owned 73% of Zenith Dynamics. Marcus owned 22%. The remaining 5% was held by early investors and employees. She had done it all legally. Every document was filed correctly. Every tax form was submitted properly. Every transaction was above board. And Marcus had no idea. His signature was on most of the papers. In his mind, they were routine corporate filings. Administrative tasks that Elaine handled while he focused on the bigger picture. That was their arrangement, wasn't it? He had the vision. She had the details. That's how he saw it. When Elaine told him she was pregnant, he said something that should have terrified her. He said, "Once the baby comes, you'll probably need to step back anyway. Focus on motherhood. I can handle the company from here." She looked at him across their kitchen table and said nothing. But inside, something crystallized. She had spent 5 years building this company. She had spent 5 years being invisible. She had restructured their entire financial future while he took credit for her work. And now he was suggesting that she step aside, as if her contributions were always meant to be temporary. As if she was always just the supporting character in his story. That night, she made a decision. It was a Saturday night in December, almost 2 weeks before Christmas. Marcus's parents were visiting from Minnesota. They did this every year, spending a week with their son, staying in the guest room of the house that Elaine had decorated and furnished. Marcus's sister Jennifer and her husband Robert were coming too. It was supposed to be a joyful family gathering, the kind of event where Elaine's pregnancy would be celebrated, where the upcoming grandchild would be toasted. Marcus spent the afternoon preparing. He wanted everything to be perfect. He bought an expensive bottle of wine. He made sure the dining room was pristine. He showered and dressed in designer clothes that he'd bought with money that Elaine had earned. Elaine prepared the meal. A beautiful dinner. Roasted salmon. Fresh vegetables. A salad made from heirloom tomatoes. She moved through the kitchen with purpose, knowing exactly what the evening was about to become. She had made her decision weeks ago. She had spoken to her lawyers. The paperwork was ready. The announcement was planned. This dinner, she had decided, would be the moment everything changed. Marcus's family arrived at 6 o'clock. His mother hugged Elaine carefully, mindful of her pregnancy. His father complimented the house. Jennifer brought wine and flowers. Robert brought stories from his week. They sat at the table, and for the first hour, everything was normal. They talked about travel plans. They laughed at old family stories. They celebrated the upcoming holidays. Then Marcus's father asked about the company. He said, "So Marcus, how's that business venture going? I was reading an article about Zenith Dynamics in a business magazine last month. They mentioned your company's growth." Marcus's face lit up. This was his favorite topic. He set down his wine glass and leaned back in his chair with the kind of confidence that comes from believing you've earned everything you have. He talked about his vision for Zenith Dynamics. He talked about the clients they'd secured. He talked about the market they'd identified and how he'd position the company to dominate that market. He talked for 12 minutes without mentioning Elaine once. Not once. His mother looked at him with pride. His sister nodded along, impressed by her brother's success. Robert asked questions about expansion plans and profit margins, and Marcus answered them as if these were things he alone had conceived. When he finally paused to take a drink, his mother said, "Jennifer, isn't your brother just impressive?" And Jennifer agreed. She said, "You must be so proud, Elaine. Your husband is really something." That's when Elaine spoke. Her voice was calm, measured. She said, "Actually, I should clarify something. I restructured the equity in Zenith Dynamics last year. I handle all of the strategic financial decisions. I've been the one making those client connections Marcus mentioned, and I own the majority stake in the company." The table went silent. Not the comfortable silence of a pause in conversation. The heavy silence of shock. Marcus's fork was halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly. His face flushed red. Jennifer exchanged a look with her husband. Marcus's mother said, "I'm sorry, what?" Elaine repeated herself, calmly. "I own 73% of Zenith Dynamics. Marcus owns 22%. The rest is held by investors. I've been the primary architect of our company strategy for the last 3 years." Marcus stood up from the table. He said, "Elaine, what the hell are you talking about?" His voice was loud, angry, shocked. His father set down his fork. Marcus continued, "You can't just restructure a company without telling me. That's my company. I built that." Elaine looked at him with an expression that was neither angry nor cold. "It was simply factual," she said. "You signed every document. I showed you the filings. You didn't read them. That's not my responsibility." Marcus's face grew darker. He said things he would later regret. He said she was trying to undermine him. He said she was being manipulative. He said she tricked him. And as he spoke, as his voice grew louder, as his family watched in shock, something happened in him. Something broke. He stood up from the table, and in a moment that would change everything, he raised his hand. His hand moved through the air. His palm made contact with the side of Elaine's face. The sound was sharp, unmistakable, a slap that echoed through the dining room and into the kitchen and up the stairs of their beautiful home. Elaine's head turned slightly with the impact. She didn't cry out. She didn't scream. She simply closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked directly at Marcus. Jennifer gasped. Marcus's mother said, "Oh my God." Robert stood up from the table. Marcus's father stood up slowly, and when he looked at his son, his expression was one of profound disappointment. Marcus realized what he'd done. He realized it in the moment after his hand had made contact with his wife's face. He realized it when he saw the shock on everyone's faces. He realized it when he looked at Elaine and saw no tears, no fear, only a kind of terrible calmness. Elaine stood up from the table. She placed her napkin on her chair. She said, very quietly, "You're fired, Marcus." Effective immediately, and then she walked out of the dining room. The family sat in stunned silence. Marcus's mother was crying quietly. His father stared at him with an expression of disgust that Marcus would never forget. Jennifer was shaking. Robert didn't know what to do with his hands. Marcus sat back down. He said, "I didn't mean to. I didn't." But the words felt empty. Because he had meant to do something. He had meant to assert his power. He had meant to remind Elaine that he was the head of this household, the leader of this company, the person in charge. He just hadn't meant to do it with violence. Not like that. Not in front of his family. Elaine returned 10 minutes later. She was holding her phone. She said, "I've called my lawyers. You'll be receiving formal termination paperwork by Monday morning. Your severance is substantial. There's also a non-disparagement clause. You cannot speak negatively about Zenith Dynamics. You cannot claim founding status. You cannot discuss company operations or strategy with anyone. If you violate this, you'll owe the company $2 million in damages." She paused. Then she said, "You may see the baby 3 days a week, pending a custody arrangement that my lawyer will negotiate with yours. That's all. I'd like you to leave now." The dinner was over. The family gathering that was supposed to be joyful had become a reckoning. And Marcus's life, as he knew it, was about to be dismantled. By Monday morning, the news had spread through Zenith Dynamics like wildfire. The CEO had fired her husband. The founder had been terminated. By Monday afternoon, Elaine had issued an official statement. She identified herself as the primary architect of Zenith's strategy. She outlined her restructuring of company equity. She explained that the founder, who had previously been identified as the face of the company, was no longer affiliated with the organization. The statement was professional. It was factual. It was devastating. Within 48 hours, major business publications were covering the story. Forbes ran a piece titled, "The Woman Behind the Vision." Bloomberg published an analysis of how a spouse could restructure company equity without the other spouse's knowledge. LinkedIn exploded with comments from people who claimed to have worked at Zenith, many corroborating Elaine's version of events. They said things like, "Elaine has always been the strategic mind, and Marcus took credit for her work constantly. And this is the most honest thing that's happened in tech all year." Marcus tried to give an interview to defend himself, but his lawyer advised against it. The non-disparagement clause meant he literally couldn't speak about the company, the situation, or his side of the story without facing legal consequences. So he remained silent, and his silence was interpreted as guilt. His reputation began to crumble. Friends and colleagues distanced themselves from him. Investors who had worked with him for years suddenly remembered that all their successful deals had been closed by Elaine. His LinkedIn profile, which had once listed him as founder and CEO, was now obsolete. He was a man without a company, without a title, without a narrative that made sense to anyone anymore. Marcus considered suing Elaine for wrongful termination. His lawyer told him the case was unwinnable. She'd followed all the legal protocols. She had majority equity. She had the authority to terminate him. The documents he'd signed gave him no protections. He considered claiming emotional distress from the public nature of his firing, but his lawyer explained that this would require him to go to trial, which would mean he'd have to speak publicly about the company anyway, which would violate his non-disparagement clause. He was caught in a trap of his own making, a trap that Elaine had carefully constructed over years. He received a severance check for $3 million. It was generous. It was also an insult, because $3 million was a fraction of what Zenith Dynamics would eventually be worth. Elaine had given him enough to live comfortably for years, enough to start over if he wanted to, but not enough to compete with her or to reclaim what he'd lost. His family's reaction devastated him in ways that money couldn't address. His father sent him a letter that said, "I never raised you to be a man who would raise his hand to a woman. I never raised you to be a man who would dismiss his partner's contributions. I'm ashamed of who you've become." His mother, when he called to apologize, cried and asked him to get help. His sister didn't return his calls for 2 months. When she finally did, she said only, "I believe Elaine's version of events completely, and I support her." The isolation was complete. He wasn't just fired. He was exiled from his own family. What Marcus didn't understand, what nobody outside of Elaine's inner circle knew, was that her restructuring wasn't impulsive. It wasn't a reaction to being dismissed or overlooked. It was premeditated. It was planned. Elaine had been documenting everything for 2 years. Every board meeting where Marcus took credit for her work. Every investor call where he minimized her contributions. Every promise he made to elevate her role that never materialized. She had hired a private investigator to document his behavior outside of work. She had consulted with therapists about whether she was being gaslit. She had spoken with friends who told her repeatedly that what she was experiencing was a form of emotional abuse, regardless of whether it was intentional. And she had come to a conclusion that terrified and empowered her simultaneously. She could not change Marcus. She could not make him see her contributions. She could not force him to respect her work. But she could change the structure. She could restructure the power dynamic. She could take control of the narrative. And so she did. The most shocking part of her plan, when later examined, was how patient she had been. How methodical. How she had never let him know what was coming. She had smiled at him. She had worked beside him. She had supported his confidence and his ambitions. And all the while, she had been constructing his downfall. Some would call this justice. Some would call it revenge. Some would call it calculated manipulation. The truth was that it was all three. 8 months after giving birth to their daughter, Sophia, Elaine faced a decision that would define who she was, beyond the corporate restructuring and beyond the public vindication. Marcus reached out. He said he wanted to see his daughter. He said he'd been in therapy for 6 months. He said he was sober, having quit drinking shortly after the incident. He said he understood that what he'd done was unforgivable, and he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was just asking for the chance to be a father. Elaine considered this carefully. She could have denied him access to Sophia. The custody arrangements she'd proposed would have given her sole custody with supervised visitation. She had the power to do this. But she chose differently. She agreed to meet with him. They met at a coffee shop, neutral territory. Marcus looked like a different man. He was thinner. His eyes had a clarity that they hadn't had before. He looked at Elaine and said, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for every time I dismissed your work. I'm sorry for taking credit for your ideas. I'm sorry for raising my hand to you. I'm sorry for not seeing you." Elaine listened. When he finished, she said, "I didn't restructure the company out of hate. I did it because I couldn't let you destroy me. I did it because I realized that as long as I stayed in that company with you, as long as I tried to prove my worth to you, that's all I'd ever be. Someone trying to convince you she mattered. So I changed the game. And I took control of my own narrative." Marcus nodded. He said, "I know. I understand that now. Elaine continued, I'm offering you something. A consulting contract with Zenith. A real role. Real compensation. 600,000 a year. Visitation rights with Sophia 3 days a week. But you work for me. Not with me. For me. You take direction from me. You report to me. You operate within the boundaries I set. Can you live with that? Marcus thought about it. Then he said, yes, I can. I deserve that. And so that's exactly what happened. Marcus became a consultant for Zenith Dynamics. He earned $600,000 a year, substantial money, but not a fortune. Not enough to make him feel like he'd retained power. Just enough to give him dignity and purpose. He saw Sophia 3 days a week. They built a relationship that was separate from Elaine, but connected to her through their daughter. On Sophia's first birthday, Marcus and Elaine stood together with their daughter between them, and a family photo was taken. They weren't together. They would never be together again. But they had found a way to coexist. Over the next 2 years, Zenith Dynamics continued to grow under Elaine's leadership. She hired new executives. She brought in a board of directors. She professionalized the company in ways that Marcus never could have. When Zenith went public, the IPO valued the company at $800 million. Elaine's 73% stake made her worth nearly $600 million. She became a case study in business schools. She was featured in Forbes, in Inc., in Wired magazine. She was invited to speak at technology conferences. Young entrepreneurs, particularly women, reached out to tell her that her story inspired them, that it showed them that they didn't have to accept a secondary role in something they'd built. Marcus watched this from the sidelines. He attended company meetings and offered strategic advice when asked. He saw his daughter grow up. He slowly rebuilt his relationship with his family. It took time. It took genuine change. But it happened. His father eventually came to respect the man he became after losing everything.